is from Burkina Faso, where the program to curb malaria, funded by billionaire Bill Gates, has been suspended by the military junta.
What did Africa do to deserve being treated so badly by the West? For decades, it's been the same pattern. If it's not a Western government pressuring an African leader to fall in line, it's a Western corporation exploiting African resources. And if it's not that, it's Western NGOs and philanthropic foundations running projects that often serve their own agendas rather than the people they claim to help. But something is changing. Some African nations are rising up, choosing to take their destiny into their own hands. Burkina Faso is one of them. Recently, the country made headlines when it suspended a so-called anti-malaria project funded by none other than Bill Gates. Not only did Burkina Faso halt the initiative, it promised to destroy all the samples associated with it. This decision shocked many in the international community. Why would a country at war with disease and poverty reject a global health project? Why turn away from billions in Western aid? Was this an act of bold sovereignty or a reckless gamble? We may never know how he does it, but somehow Bill Gates, America's billionaire philanthropist, has managed to convince millions that he is Africa's greatest friend. Year after year, project after project, his foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, presents itself as the savior of a continent. From vaccines to agriculture, from food aid to health programs, the message is always the same. Gates is here to solve Africa's problems. But scratch beneath the surface, and a different picture emerges. Because behind the glossy campaigns and polished press releases, there are deeper, more controversial motives. Take, for example, Target Malaria, a project heavily funded by the Gates Foundation. On paper, its goal is simple: to control malaria in Africa, a disease that kills hundreds of thousands every year. The idea? To develop genetically modified mosquitoes that carry a special trait designed to reduce the population of malaria-carrying insects. In theory, if you reduce the number of mosquitoes, you reduce the number of malaria infections. A bold, futuristic idea. Target Malaria has already set up research labs across Africa, in Burkina Faso, Mali, Uganda, and Ghana. And on the surface, it all sounds like innovation at its finest. But here's the catch. This project is still in its earliest stages. It will take years, possibly decades, before anyone can prove it actually works. Which means in the meantime, countless experiments will be carried out. And not in sealed, controlled labs in the West, but in African communities, among real people. And that's where the controversy begins. Because for many, the idea of experimenting with genetically modified insects in villages and towns where ordinary Africans live, eat, farm, and raise their children feels less like help and more like exploitation. Back in 2019, Target Malaria began its field research in Burkina Faso. That same year, the project released its very first swarm of genetically modified male mosquitoes in Bana, a small hamlet of just about 1,000 people in the country's west. It was a quiet experiment, but it marked the first time in history that such engineered insects had been unleashed in Africa. Since then, the project expanded, spreading its trials to other locations, and most recently, releasing fresh batches of genetically altered mosquitoes. But then came a shock. Days later, under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's authorities ordered the suspension of Target Malaria's operations in the country. And this is where the debate begins. On the surface, the project claimed to be fighting malaria, one of Africa's deadliest diseases. But the solution it proposed, wiping out an entire species of insect, raised questions that could not be ignored. Yes, the Anopheles mosquito transmits malaria, but nature is a delicate web, and every species, even the most hated, has its place in the ecosystem. Ecologists warn that erasing mosquitoes from the food chain could trigger ripple effects. Certain plants, such as the blunt-leaf bog orchid and goldenrod, rely on mosquitoes for pollination. Small fish, amphibians, and bat species that feed heavily on mosquitoes might suddenly face shortages, with their populations collapsing in turn. And there's more. Mosquito larvae play a role in aquatic systems, helping break down organic matter and cycling nutrients. Remove them, and streams, ponds, and wetlands could be thrown into imbalance. In short, wiping out malaria might save human lives, but at what hidden cost to the environment? That was the dilemma. And for Burkina Faso's new leadership, the risks outweighed the promises. In other words, while the health benefits of eliminating mosquito-borne diseases are undeniable, the risks of disrupting entire food webs could unleash consequences that are unpredictable and potentially irreversible. But perhaps the most troubling issue is this: the experiments are being carried out in Africa, not in Europe, where the modified strains were actually developed. These genetically altered mosquitoes were created in laboratories in the West. Yet instead of releasing them in European environments, where scientists could study the effects close to home, they were shipped to Africa and released in rural villages, among some of the world's poorest and most vulnerable populations. And that raises a haunting question. Why is Africa always the testing ground? Why do these powerful institutions continue to treat Africans as expendable, as if their lives matter less? For them, Africans are not equals. They are test subjects, little more than data points in risky experiments that would never be allowed in Western nations. It's not difficult to understand why Captain Traoré's government took decisive action to suspend Target Malaria's operations. At first, back in 2019, the project had been given the green light by Burkina Faso's National Biosafety Agency, the National Environmental Assessment Agency, and the Health Research Ethics Committee. Local communities like Sorokudingen in Hue province were even consulted before the first releases. But with time, the questions mounted. The more Burkina Faso's authorities examined the project, the clearer it became that the risks outweighed the promises, and that the ethics of using African soil as a laboratory for Western science were deeply flawed. This wasn't just about mosquitoes. It was about sovereignty, dignity, and the right of African nations to decide for themselves whether to be the world's guinea pigs. In a statement posted on social media, Target Malaria defended its work. The organization claimed that it had secured all the necessary approvals. According to them, the National Biosafety Agency, ANB, and the National Environmental Assessment Agency, ANEV, gave the green light in July 2025 for the controlled release of what they called non-gene drive, genetically modified male bias mosquitoes. The project, they added, was also approved by the Ethics Committee for Health Research. On August 11th, Target Malaria announced it had successfully carried out a small-scale release, supposedly in full compliance with the conditions of those permits. On paper, this sounded like a project carefully vetted by science and law. But here's the truth. Approvals stamped on government documents mean nothing when the risks are this high. A green light from regulatory agencies does not erase the possibility of environmental damage, nor does it answer the ethical questions of why Africa is once again being used as a testing ground. And thankfully, not everyone stayed silent. In Burkina Faso, civil society groups raised the alarm. Leading the charge was the Coalition for Monitoring Biotechnological Activities, a watchdog network that denounced the project as risky, opaque, and potentially dangerous. For them, the issue wasn't just about malaria. It was about sovereignty, transparency, and the right of Africans to say no to untested science carried out on their soil. This clash between a powerful Western-funded research project and grassroots African organizations showed the deep divide. On one side, billion-dollar foundations pushing futuristic solutions. On the other, local communities demanding accountability, warning that what looks like innovation could instead bring disaster. Ali Tapsoba, one of the leading voices of the Coalition for Monitoring Biotechnological Activities, didn't mince his words. The problem is the solution proposed by Target Malaria, which consists of eliminating the vector using gene-drive mosquitoes, he warned. This technology, he argued, was highly controversial, unpredictable, and raised ethical questions that could not be ignored. The impacts of gene-drive organisms on health and ecosystems remain unknown and potentially irreversible. Critics went further. They pointed out that the genetically modified strains being released in Burkina Faso were not even developed there. They originated in European laboratories. To many Africans, that fact alone made this project reek of scientific neo-colonialism. Once again, powerful institutions in the West were using Africa as their testing ground, while keeping their own populations safe. Campaigners across Africa accused Target Malaria not only of ethical overreach, but of worsening the very problem it claimed to solve. Instead of reducing malaria, they said, the releases risked creating new complications, even fueling its spread. And then came the breaking point. Just days after Target Malaria carried out yet another release of its engineered mosquitoes, the Burkinabe authorities delivered their verdict. In a formal statement, Samuel Pear, chief official at the Ministry of Higher Education and Research, ordered the NGO to halt all activities in the country. All samples will be destroyed according to a strict protocol, he declared. With that announcement, Burkina Faso became the first African nation to slam the door shut on the project. Target Malaria tried to soften the blow, reiterating that it had complied with national laws and international biosafety standards. It promised to continue cooperating with authorities. But the truth was undeniable. Its operations in Burkina Faso were over. For Captain Traoré's government, the decision was about more than mosquitoes. It was about sovereignty, dignity, and the right of Africans to decide what experiments take place on their land. We applaud the decision of the authorities in Burkina Faso. Predictably, critics in the West have already tried to spin the story. Some claim this is just part of a broader crackdown on foreign-backed NGOs under Captain Ibrahim Traoré. They say Traoré has increasingly sought to limit foreign influence, especially projects tied to high-profile Western philanthropists like Bill Gates. But this narrative misses the bigger picture. For Traoré, this isn't about waging war on NGOs or cutting ties with the outside world. After all, Burkina Faso has openly said it is willing to rebuild relations with the United States, on one condition, that it be based on mutual respect and mutual benefit. This isn't isolationism, it's protection. Protection of Burkinabe sovereignty, protection of Burkinabe citizens, protection from being treated as lab rats for experiments that would never be allowed in the West. Target Malaria, after all, is just one example in a long list of Gates-funded projects across Africa. And behind the polished promises of health and development, critics say there's a pattern, a darker agenda that many believe points toward the depopulation of the continent. For years, analysts and observers have raised red flags, but their warnings have often been dismissed as conspiracy theories. And yet, when you connect the dots, the experimental vaccines, the genetic modification projects, the push to control African agriculture, the picture becomes harder to ignore. To Burkina Faso, shutting down Target Malaria was more than a political decision. It was a declaration. Africa will no longer be a testing ground. But perhaps the most damning evidence comes from Bill Gates' own words. In 2010, during a TED Talk, Gates said, "First, we've got the population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. To his supporters, this was not a call for depopulation. They insist that Gates was saying something very different, that improving healthcare reduces child mortality, which in turn slows population growth because families no longer feel pressured to have many children. In other words, he was linking healthcare to reduced carbon emissions and a stabilized global population. But for many Africans, the words hit differently, especially when Gates kept repeating them. In 2012, in an interview with Larry Cohen, he once again said population growth could be slowed through improved healthcare. In 2018, in a video titled, "Does Saving More Lives Lead to Overpopulation?" Gates doubled down on the same argument. That same year, he published an article titled, "Africa's Rapid Population Growth Puts Poverty Progress at Risk." In it, he wrote that Africa's growing population was a challenge, and that the best way to tackle it was by expanding access to birth control, paired with investments in health and education. To many Africans, the message was clear. The problem, in Gates's eyes, was not poverty itself, not decades of Western exploitation, not corrupt international systems, but African babies. The more Africa's population grows, the more it is painted as a risk. This is why so many across the continent view projects like Target Malaria with suspicion. When the same billionaire who funds genetically modified mosquitoes also speaks of reducing population growth in Africa, it's not paranoia, it's history repeating itself. Africans have seen this before, in colonization, in sterilization campaigns, in medical experiments where they were treated as expendable. For critics, Gates's language is not just about health, it's about control. Doesn't all of this show that Bill Gates is obsessed with population control, especially in Africa? Over and over again, whenever he speaks about Africa, the conversation somehow circles back to slowing population growth. How is this just a conspiracy theory when the evidence comes directly from his own words and projects? And here's the irony. Africa is not even the most populous continent. As of 2025, Africa's entire population is projected at 1.43 billion. That's spread across more than 50 countries. Meanwhile, India alone has 1.46 billion people, and China is hovering at 1.4 billion. Just 2 Asian countries make up more than 1/3 of the world's total population. So how exactly is Africa overpopulated? If population control were truly the goal, shouldn't the focus be on Asia or even on the United States, where Gates himself lives? After all, the US consumes far more resources per person than the average African country. But no, the spotlight is always on Africa, the continent with the highest number of poor countries, the least global influence, and the weakest defenses against outside manipulation. And then comes another example, the newly released hormonal intrauterine device, or IUD, backed by the Gates Foundation. This device, the first of its kind, promises up to 8 years of contraception. But here's the detail that fuels suspicion. It wasn't launched in the US or in Europe or anywhere in the West. Instead, its first rollout was in Africa, beginning in Kenya and later Nigeria. To critics, this is not coincidence. It's a pattern. Experimental malaria projects in Burkina Faso, contraceptive devices tested first in African women, a constant drumbeat of speeches framing Africa's population as a problem. To them, this isn't about empowering women or saving lives, it's about control, a greater plan, targeted specifically at Africa. According to the Gates Foundation, Sub-Saharan Africa has some of the highest rates of unmet need for family planning anywhere in the world. They point to cost, long distances to health facilities, and even cultural opposition as barriers. But here's the contradiction. Instead of addressing these barriers directly by building affordable healthcare facilities, training more doctors, and bringing services closer to the people, they chose to introduce an entirely new hormonal device, a device not widely used in the West, a device designed to stay inside a woman's body for up to 8 years. Doesn't that sound suspicious? And there are deeper questions, questions that nobody seems eager to answer. How thoroughly has this device actually been tested over such a long time span? Who exactly participated in these trials, and where were they carried out? Were African women informed participants in these studies, or were they simply the easiest test subjects? And most importantly, what are the possible side effects, both short and long term, for women's health? We already know that current hormonal birth control pills, even after decades of refinement, carry serious side effects. Increased risk of fibroids, infertility, cardiovascular issues, and even certain cancers. If these risks exist for a pill that stays in the body for only hours at a time, imagine the potential consequences of a hormonal device designed to remain in place for nearly a decade. This is the heart of the concern, not the glossy promises of empowerment and choice presented by philanthropists, but the reality that Africa has once again become the testing ground for technologies not yet trusted in the West. The truth is glaring for all to see. Piece by piece, project by project, the pattern reveals itself. There is a deliberate attempt to control Africa's population. Bill Gates's programs may be wrapped in the language of health and philanthropy, but the common thread is always the same: slowing African growth. But here's the reality. Africa is not overpopulated. Far from it. In fact, Africa's greatest strength lies in its people, its youth, its energy, its vast human capital. That is the continent's most valuable resource. Why then would anyone want to take that away? Why would anyone see Africa's growing population not as an opportunity, but as a threat? The most painful part is that some African leaders have eagerly embraced these programs, turning a blind eye to the risks because there is money involved. For them, foreign dollars weigh heavier than African dignity. And yet, there are others, leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who have drawn a line in the sand. Leaders who understand that sovereignty means saying no, even when the pressure is immense. The fact is simple. Africa's challenges have never been about its population. They have always been about governance. Corruption, incompetence, and weak leadership have cost Africa far more than population growth ever could. And the solutions will never come from outside. They will not come from billionaires, from foreign NGOs, or from Western institutions. They will come from Africans, leaders, innovators, and citizens, taking their destiny into their own hands. So the question remains, will Africa continue to allow itself to be the testing ground for other people's experiments? Or will more nations follow the example of Burkina Faso, reclaiming sovereignty and charting their own course? Once again, the choice is Africa's to make. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below, and don't forget to like this video, share your opinion, and subscribe to our channel.